Hello, my name is Roger Berkowitz, and I'm the founder and academic director of the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. I'm going to be talking today about Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. This book is actually split up into 3 books, and the first one is called Antisemitism, and that's what I'll be talking about today. Arendt begins the book with a preface, and on Roman numeral 11, she writes, Antisemitism, a secular 19th century ideology, which in name, though not in argument, was unknown before the 1870s, and religious Jew hatred, inspired by the mutually hostile antagonism of 2 conflicting creeds, are obviously not the same. Now, this isn't so obvious to many people, but let's understand what she means. First, anti-Semitism is not the same as hating Jews. And we see this even in the way she writes the word, anti-Semitism. Usually, anti-Semitism is written with anti-capital S Semitism. And the idea is that it's a hatred of a particular people, the Semites, the Jews. Arendt writes it as one word, no hyphen, lowercase s. And she does that to emphasize that anti-Semitism is not actually about the Jews. It has very little to do with Judaism or Jewishness in her mind. What is it? Well, it's a 19th century. That means it's something that emerged in largely Europe in the 19th century, and a time of great Jewish assimilation into European society. And it's a secular ideology. That means it really has nothing to do with religion. It has nothing to do with Jews and what they believe, their creed. It has very little to do with the opposition between Jews and Christians. It actually was often held by people like the Nazis who didn't identify as Christians. And it's an ideology, and that is probably the most important part of the definition. It's an idea that has pseudoscientific foundations, seeks to be true, that makes claims that if this ideology were followed, the world would be a much better place. So communism is an ideology that says if we can just create a basic equality of all production, there will be a kind of utopia. And anti-Semitism is an ideology which says if we get rid of the Jews, the world will be a better place. Arendt talks a lot about ideology later in the book. It's a very important concept. If you want to look forward and read a little bit about it, you can do so on pages 159 and on 468 to 469. So she continues in this preface, and near the end of the preface, she has an important sentence distinguishing anti-Semitism as part of the prehistory of totalitarianism, but not itself part of totalitarianism itself. And so she writes on page Roman numeral 15, totalitarian politics, far from being simply anti-Semitic or racist or imperialist or communist, use and abuse their own ideological and political elements until the basis of factual reality, from which the ideologies originally derived their strength and their propaganda value, the reality of class struggle, for instance, or the interest conflict between Jews and their neighbors, have all but disappeared. And so this is an important point in a couple of ways. One is all ideologies have a real foundation in the world. Communism doesn't come out of nowhere. It comes out of the reality of class struggle and the reality of inequality. Anti-Semitism comes out of the reality of real conflicts between Jews and their neighbors. Racism comes out of the real conflicts between whites and blacks, to take one example of racism. But what she's saying is that totalitarian politics is not one of these isms, racism, anti-Semitism, communism. It's when these isms become divorced, so divorced from the real foundations, the real world foundations that gave rise to them in the first place, that they can justify actions that have nothing to do with the worldly situation out of which the ideologies arise. And thus, this disconnect between the ideology and reality allows the ideology to justify extraordinary acts, totalizing acts, acts of total domination, as we'll see as we get to the end of the book, that can go so far as to completely deny the dignity and degrade the dignity of human beings, which has nothing to do with the original ideology itself. And this is the root of totalitarian politics. So for Arendt, it's important for us to recognize, and she'll say this on page 16, that while anti-Semitism and racism are important, they themselves, and here she quotes, cannot explain why the totalitarian claim to global rule, to be exercised by members and methods of a secret society, should become an attractive political goal at all. This latter, politically much more relevant function has its origins in imperialism. So imperialism is really the part of the book and the ideology that moves racism or anti-Semitism towards totalitarian politics. And part of that relation is that imperialism rejects the limits of nations and states, expands politics to be international and without limits and with infinite growth. And that is part of Arendt's argument, and we'll get there and spend a lot of time on this when we read the sections on imperialism. The structure of the book on anti-Semitism is simple. There's 4 chapters. The first chapter asks after some common sense fallacies about anti-Semitism. So she's going to talk about 4 common sense arguments about why anti-Semitism emerged and what it is, and she's going to say they're all wrong. So it's the negative chapter. And then chapters 2 and 3 deal respectively with political anti-Semitism, which is, in her mind, the core of anti-Semitism in its connection to totalitarianism. And then in chapter 3, social anti-Semitism or discrimination, which is important, but itself not the root of totalitarianism. And then chapter 4 is about the Dreyfus Affair. The Dreyfus Affair was an important historical event in France in the late 19th century, and it was, for Arendt, the dress rehearsal for the Nazis. In fact, she thinks that anti-Semitism in France was worse than it was in Germany. It's a controversial point. But the reason anti-Semitism in France didn't turn into totalitarianism, whereas it did in Germany, is because the French anti-Semites remained nationalist. And as nationalist, they were committed to the limit of the French nation. And this made it impossible for them to, A, completely reject the dignity and rights of Jews who were French citizens, and also prevented them from seeking a world-dominating religion ideology that would have no limits. And so she's going to look at the Dreyfus Affair as a sort of early manifestation of extreme anti-Semitism and how it almost activated a kind of totalitarian politics, but did not. So, chapter 1, which is anti-Semitism as an outrage to common sense, begins with the discrepancy, as Arendt names it, between the fact that Jews are a tiny little people, very few Jews in the world, and yet somehow this ideology against this Jewish people started the whole infernal machine in motion of Nazism and totalitarianism. And she says that this is an outrage to common sense. How could this have happened? And then there are 4 answers, and she thinks they're all wrong, but let's go through them quickly. The first is that anti-Semitism is related to nationalism. She thinks this is wrong. In fact, she says, the fact is, quote, that modern anti-Semitism grew in proportion as traditional nationalism declined. In a sense, this is going to fit with her argument in chapter 2 that it was the decline of the nation state and the association of Jews with the nation state that contributed to the rise of political anti-Semitism. But again, one of the key insights here is that if you're a real nationalist, you support all people who are parts of your nation, including the Jews. So nationalism, she wants to say, is rarely racist. And she's very clear that both the Nazis and the Bolsheviks, the two great examples of totalitarianism that she addresses, were not nationalists. They were internationalists. They were both internationalists, imperialists, global movements. The second fallacy is that anti-Semitism is a reaction to the Jews' great wealth and power. So she thinks this is wrong. Again, it is not a reaction to their wealth and power. It is a reaction to their continued wealth after they had lost their power. She cites Tocqueville talking about the French aristocracy on pages 17 to 18. And the argument here is that the French aristocrats were loved, even though they were wealthy, so long as they had power, and that power was meaningful in French society. Once the French aristocrats lost their power, their role in French life, but kept their wealth, that is when the French people, in a sense, gave up on and came to resent the aristocrats and revolted. The same, she thinks, is true with the Jews. The Jews were not hated so long as they were useful and powerful in politics. They became hated at a time when they were still wealthy, but their usefulness and power in politics had disappeared. And again, the argument is the Jews were associated with the national governments in Europe, and once the national governments declined, and once they became objects of derision, the Jews' use in politics was reduced, and yet they remained wealthy, and that wealth seemed unjustified. The third common sense fallacy is that the Jews are innocent victims or scapegoats. Now, this one we have to be very careful with, because there's no claim here of Arendt blaming the Jews. She's not saying the Jews are to blame for anti-Semitism, and yet she wants to say that they are in some ways responsible. This is an argument that she's going to make in a different way in her book on Adolf Eichmann that gets her in a lot of trouble. And people said she blamed the Jews for the Holocaust. And she repeatedly said, I never did such a thing. And she's right. She doesn't blame them for the Holocaust, nor does she blame them for anti-Semitism. And yet, she says anti-Semitism wasn't an accident. She cites a joke that was often told around during World War II, where one guy comes up and says, the Jews started the war. Someone else says, yes, of course, you're right, the Jews and the bicyclists. And the other person scratched his head and said, the bicyclists? Why the bicyclists? And the other person says, why the Jews? The argument is, the Jews didn't have anything to do with the war. The Germans started the war. We know that. And Arendt is like, okay, true. But there's a reason that the Germans picked the Jews and not the bicyclists. That doesn't mean it's a good reason. Doesn't mean the Jews were wrong or that they were guilty. But we have to, if we want to understand what happened, we have to ask why the Jews, which is something that you can't do if you think that they're just innocent victims and scapegoats. And so she wants to ask that. The fourth fallacy is the fallacy of eternal anti-Semitism. Here it's a simple argument. Why the Jews? Well, it's always been the Jews. People have always attacked the Jews. They're attacking the Jews now. No, there's no further inquiry necessary. And Arendt thinks this is too easy. On the one hand, anti-Semites like this argument because they can say, don't blame us. This has been happening for a long time, thousands of years. Everyone hates the Jews. And she says Jews like this argument too because they don't want to discuss what they've done to make them the scapegoats, to make them the choice of anti-Semites. And so here she announces her thesis, which she does on page 7 of this section, which is that in a certain way, the Jews need anti-Semitism to survive. And this is because anti-Semitism emerges around the same time of Jewish assimilation. The assimilation project is working, and with the birth of she writes on page 7, the birth of modern anti-Semitism has been accompanied by and interconnected with Jewish assimilation, the secularization and withering away of the old religious and spiritual values of Judaism. What actually happened was that the great parts of the Jewish people were at the same time threatened with physical extinction from without and dissolution from within. The Jews were threatened from dissolution within because if they were to assimilate, there wouldn't be much left of being Jewish. And so she says, in this situation, Jews concerned with the survival of their people would, in a curious, desperate misinterpretation, hit on the consoling idea that anti-Semitism, after all, might be an excellent means for keeping the people together, so that the assumption of eternal anti-Semitism would even imply an eternal guarantee of Jewish existence. This is an argument that a lot of people are going to have problems with, and we should speak about it. I don't think in any way she is blaming the Jews for anti-Semitism or the Holocaust. But she is saying something which is uncomfortable for many people, and we have to address it, which is that the Jews found anti-Semitism useful. They didn't find genocide useful, let's be clear, but they found anti-Semitism useful because, as Arendt says, she never felt more than as a Jew, and she always identified a Jew when she was attacked as a Jew. When there's anti-Semites and you're a Jew, there's reason to affirm your Judaism. And so she thinks this is in many ways the grounds for, well, for what? And here's where we need to now ask, okay, what is this ideology of anti-Semitism and how did it emerge? And in chapter 2, now trying to provide a positive answer to that question, is called The Jews, the Nation State, and the Birth of Anti-Semitism, and it really concerns what she calls political anti-Semitism. And there are two paradoxes that she begins the chapter with. The first paradox is on page 12, or is stated on page 12, which is, and I quote, "Thus at the same time and in the same countries, emancipation meant equality and privileges." So we have emancipation, assimilation, but there are edicts around Europe, including France and Germany, where Jews are, in a sense, emancipated, given freedom that they did not have prior to this to live as citizens. At the same time, they were granted certain privileges for banking and for other activities, and also to not assimilate. They were granted privileges to, in a sense, remain living in Jewish ghettos, in Jewish communities. And we think, oh my God, the Jews were in ghettos. That shows how anti-Semitic these countries were. But again, one of the things we have to understand is that the Jews, in many ways, wanted to continue to live in the ghettos because then they could continue to practice their Judaism and be separate and be different, which they wanted to be. And so the paradox is that at the same time that we were seeing ideas of equality emerge, and the ideas that Jews could be equal citizens, the Jews didn't want to give up their separateness and distinction. They wanted to continue to live separately and in ghettos. And this is a paradox that Arendt explores deeply here. And so on page 13, she will say, the Jews became a well-defined, self-preserving group within one of the classes, the aristocracy or the bourgeoisie. There is no doubt that the nation-state's interest in preserving the Jews as a special group and preventing their assimilation into class society coincided with the Jewish interest in self-preservation and group survival. The second paradox that Arendt addresses in Chapter 2 is the paradox between the fact that the Jews were on the one hand a stateless and apolitical people through their history. Since the exile from Israel, they had lived in other states and did not have their own state. And for the most part, she thinks, and she argues, they were apolitical. They largely kept to themselves and did not involve themselves in the politics of the countries in which they lived. On the other hand, and here's the paradox, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the Jews became allied with the nation states. They became court Jews, bankers to the government, and received privileges from the governments, and thus became identified with the state. So on the one hand, they themselves had a history of being stateless and apolitical, and yet they became identified with the political entities of the time, the nation states. As these states became increasingly unpopular and lost their power, so did the Jews. And so these are the two paradoxes, the one of equality and privilege, and the other of a stateless, apolitical people being associated with the state. And together, these two paradoxes give rise to what Arendt calls political anti-Semitism. And the next part of this chapter traces the rise of political anti-Semitism through early anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism by the nobility, anti-Semitism by leftists, anti-Semitism by rightists, right-wing parties. And the overarching argument here is that, on the one hand, that anti-Jewish feeling, anti-Semitism, acquires a political relevance. It becomes not just anti-Jewish, anti-Jews who are Jews, but becomes politically relevant only when it can combine with a major political issue, or when Jewish group interests come into conflict with those of a major class of society. This is on page 28. It's not anti-Semitism itself or anti-Jewish feeling itself that makes anti-Semitism political and makes it important politically. It's when it combines with another issue. And thus, she will say that the real beginning of modern anti-Semitism, she says on page 37, happens at a time of financial scandals. And in these financial scandals, Jews were not involved for the most part. In fact, she goes through a fair bit of research on that. But the lower classes, which she here calls the mob, wrongly thought of Jews as representatives of the state and of capitalism. Because the Jews had been associated with the state, and because Jews had been bankers and known as part of the banking elite, she says on page 37 that the social resentment of the lower middle classes against the Jews turned into a highly explosive political element because these bitterly hated Jews were thought to be well on their way to political power. So here's the convergence of a kind of anti-Jewish feeling, which we generally don't like, and this sense that they are corrupt and engaged with the state and acquiring political power. Chapter 3 is really about social discrimination, and it's about how it is that this idea of the Jew, of this the general idea of the Jew everywhere and nowhere, the phantom Jew, emerged. How it is that Jews who had been discriminated against for millennia, hundreds of years, as Jews, as people who practiced the Jewish religion, as others, suddenly became this group in society that had very little to do with being Jewish, but had to do with what we now think of as anti-Semitic characteristics, some of which are negative, but many of which are positive as well. Some of the positive ones are sort of hardworking, value education, exceptional intellectuals, and and these ideas of the Jew, which again were stereotypes and not true in any meaningful sense, became part of this characterization of the Jew. And so she'll say on page 54 that if political anti-Semitism emerged out of Jews being separate from and privileged from society and from the classes, namely that they separated themselves in ghettos, they separated themselves with privileges, and that's what led in many ways to political anti-Semitism. Social discrimination and social anti-Semitism arose, she says, because of the growing equality of Jews with other groups. So just as there was a way in which political assimilation emerged at the time of the rising doctrine of equality, and yet the Jews claiming and also being asked to claim a kind of separateness. Social discrimination emerges at the same time because there's this growing movement for equality. All citizens should be equal. And there's many good liberals in German and French society who think we are good liberals and Jews should be equal. Therefore, they should have no privileges. They shouldn't be able to live alone. They should follow the rules like everybody else. And so in France, you have rules like for Muslims, they should be equal. They should wear a veil, or Jews should not wear a kippah. And this claim for equality leads to Jews being seen as people who want to claim a kind of difference. And this can lead to what she calls social discrimination. So acceptance of Jews, assimilation of Jews, there became a price that you had to pay to assimilate and to be accepted into society. You had to be a Jew, because we want to accept you as a Jew, but you had to give up certain characteristics and practices and traditions of your Judaism. So you had to be and not be Jews, as Arendt says. One of the most insightful and provocative points of this chapter is her claim that it is the idea of equality and the drive for the equality of conditions and the desire to make people equal that is behind the emergence of social discrimination. So on page 54, Arendt will write that the equality of conditions is one of the most uncertain ventures of the modern era. And the more equal we insist that people are, the more that the real differences that exist. So if you want to be a Jew, and we want to say you're equal, but you still want to wear a kippah, and you want to wear a talis, and you want to wear talit, and you want to pray, or if you're a Muslim today and you want to pray 3 times a day, and if you're whatever group you are, those differences continue to exist, and yet we have this ideology of equality. And since we're all equal, we have no explanation for these real differences that exist. And she says, there's one chance in 100 that in such a situation, these differences will be seen as political equality. That will say, all right, the Muslim can wear their veil and the Jew their kippah, and everyone can do what they want, and we'll all be politically equal, but we can allow for social difference. But there's 99 chances in 100, she says again on page 54, that these differences, along with the idea of equality, will lead to an ideology of normality, an idea of what's normal and what's the right way to do things, and certain differences will be seen as inferior and unacceptable. And this is the beginning of social discrimination. The final chapter of the book on the Dreyfus Affair is important because it is, as she says, a dress rehearsal for the rise of Nazism and totalitarianism. the part that I would push you to focus on is pages 106 forward. And on those pages, she speaks about the mob and what is a mob. And this is something that will become increasingly important in this book as we get further into it. The mob, she says here on page 107, is a group in which the residue of all classes are represented. This is what makes it so easy to mistake the mob for the people, which also comprises all strata of society. So the people and the mob are both all strata, but the mob is the residue. It's the people who have been left out, the superfluous people in many ways. And thus the mob comes to hate society. So she continues, for the mob hates society from which it is excluded, as well as Parliament where it is not represented. Plebiscites, therefore, with which modern mob leaders have obtained such excellent results, are an old concept of politicians who rely upon the mob. The mob can be led by great leaders, demagogues, who speak for the people against the elite, against the parliament, against society. And so she says on page 108, and she's here speaking about the mob in their relation to the Jews, excluded as it is from society and political representation, the mob turns necessity to extra parliamentary action. It is not interested in simply parliamentary or legislative action. It goes beyond that. It is inclined to seek the real forces of political life in those movements and influences which are hidden from view and work behind the scenes. And so the mob, because it's excluded from the institutions, thinks the institutions are controlled by secret societies, secret forces, and it's willing to believe these conspiracy theorists, conspiracy theories. There can be no doubt that during the 19th century, Judaism, fell into this category of being a conspiracy, as did Freemasonry and the Jesuits. It is, of course, utterly untrue that any of these groups really constituted a secret society bent on dominating the world by means of a giant conspiracy. Nevertheless, it is true that their influence, however overt it may have been, was exerted beyond the formal realm of politics, operating on a large scale in lobbies, lodges, and the confessional. And so here is a good place to end our consideration of this first book of the Origins on anti-Semitism. The Jews and the Freemasons had nothing to do with secret societies running the world. And yet, as Arendt speaks about, the Jews did play banker to many of the states. They used their international connections to negotiate and often help princes and rulers. They were, in a sense, involved in a kind of non-elective politics. And they became associated with the corruption of the nation state to that regard. Again, not to blame the Jews, but to understand that there were reasons that the Jews were selected. And that's what she's here trying to understand. Anti-Semitism as a whole is important because it provides an ideology that will be mobilized and politicized and thus divorced from its factual grounding and become part of the essence of the Nazi drive for totalitarian world domination. And we will continue with that next week. For now, enjoy reading this section, and I look forward to talking about it with you. Thank you very much.